Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Hey, Tom.
Hey, Ruth.
It's good to be here in our conversations together.
And very relevant to say, being here.
Yes.
For what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So we're just, in case anyone's just joining in randomly, there's people who follow what we do and there's people who just find us. So we're in this middle of this series, the ABCs of Thriving, and it's been great so far. And we're on the letter S today. So do you want to introduce what we're talking about?
Yes. So I thought when it came to the letter S, I thought first about sustain. If we're talking about thriving, there should be something about sustaining. Mm-hmm. And then what popped into my head was, it's a play on the sound of S, but it's technically a P from an ancient Greek term, suka. Although most people, if I spelled it and said it in English, they wouldn't hear suka. Psyche, Psyche, which is actually not the pronunciation. It's actually suka. But since we technically don't really know what the ancient Greeks sounded like when they said things, because we don't have that, and pronunciations can change. But psyche is usually thought of in terms of psychology, or the psyche and the mind. But sukha, which is where that word actually comes from, which was just taken over into English directly from Greek, pronunciation aside, sukha, psyche, is usually thought of as the mind, but the term originally meant something far, far broader than the mind. Sukha was life, being. I am, you are a being. So sukha is, and we've often talked in the podcast related to like homeostasis and AHA and that sort of thing, about body, mind, and spirit. We have a body, we have a mind, we have a spirit, and if you combine all of those together, that makes us what and who we are. Sukha. So it's more than the mind. It's self. It's being alive. It's that life force that is in us.
Yeah, and some people, it's interesting because when we were talking about the letter S, and I mentioned to you, I said, you know, it would be good to do something around spirit or spiritual. And because actually to thrive, there is an engagement with that, right? Like you said, mind, body, spirit. We can't just have mind, body. That's not gonna keep us thriving. But sukha is, so there's a part of it that is spirit, but it's not the whole. Would you say that?
Sukha is body, mind, and spirit collectively all together. And you, to thrive as a being is what we're talking about.
And so what we're saying, you know, and I think, we are human beings.
Yes.
So that's helpful, right? So
we are human sukha.
Yeah. We don't call ourselves human bodies.
No.
Or human minds, or even human spirits. We are human beings. The being is the connection of all three, and that is what sukha is. And the idea really is for thriving, there's a need for us to sustain sukha. That's to support and relieve. Did you already bring that up? The support and relieve bit?
No, not yet.
There we go. This
is back to sustain.
This is our pre-conversation slipping in right here.
Yes.
But we'll talk about that then, because that's the understanding of sustain, because not everyone knows what that means. But I think this idea of, to thrive, we can think of all the things that we need to do maybe, but actually we're paying attention to the being, the core part of who I am. I think there's something about, I've heard this before, Tom, and I think it's people not quite knowing what they're doing, but they're touching on this, and they say to me, this is the core of who I am. That is like Psyche, that is their being, the core being. And so we're talking about that today, and the importance of that.
Yes.
And the importance of allowing that to thrive, to be alive, to be free, to be nourished.
Yes.
Right? Let's talk about sustain.
Yes. Yeah. So sustain has, in one form, means to relieve pressure. So the supports for a roof relieve the gravitational pressures that would otherwise cause all of that to be on our heads and fall down. So there's the relieving of pressure, but there's also a support that is an aspect of sustain. And then there is like a third element that is the result of those two, which is a continuation. So like when I was studying music, and I would sustain a note. I would sing something and I would sustain that and carry that and hold that out. That's sustain, but there would be a relieving of pressure by the diaphragm and how I would breathe, which would allow for that. And then there would be the support for that with the diaphragm. And so it has those elements. And so if you think of it from the perspective of being, Psyche, body, mind, and spirit, it's all of those together. It's consciousness, it's unconsciousness, it's that I exist. And I can exist and it's a surviving, or I can exist or it's a thriving existence. And so sustain, Psyche, why I put those two together was because if you don't sustain Psyche, at some point, Psyche expires. And there is no Psyche. Well, technically and theoretically, the argument would be it would just take on a different form. Because as a being, I exist now. From various religious and theoretical perspectives, I exist in this body, but when this body dies, the belief is that I don't cease to exist, I just exist in another form. And whether that is a religious belief in the immortality of the Psyche, the soul, or from a scientific perspective of power, energy is never lost. It just changes form. It always exists.
Before, yeah.
Yes. And so that would be like us.
Yeah. Our beings.
We may change form. And there are many religions that have talked about different forms, reincarnation or an eternal existence in some other realm or whatever. But the idea is that the human mind has attempted to grapple with the existence and the continued existence. But particularly for today's conversation, it's about the here and now, not the then and there. It's the here and now. And how can we thrive? And what thriving requires is a sustaining of that. So with Psyche, it's body, mind, spirit, altogether, its existence, it is self-conscious or unconscious. It's our feelings, our beliefs about ourselves, others, situations. It's all of the totality that makes us individuals, and from different theoretical perspectives, not just individuals, but individuals who exist collectively. And we're supposed to, and we naturally do exist collectively. Mm-hmm. And to sustain that, mm-hmm. to relieve the pressures that inevitably we experience, to support life, being alive, mm-hmm. and the continuation of that and the energy put into that. So this is as comprehensive a letter of the thriving, support, sustain, Psyche as any of them are.
Mm. And how much of this is, so I guess I'm curious about what it looks like. What's the reality as to mm-hmm. why people aren't sustaining Psyche? Like, what's the alternative here? Why? And like I think you mentioned, it might be that they're, if you don't sustain Psyche, maybe you're surviving, maybe you're not even surviving. Mm-hmm. But what are the pressures, Tom? Like, what comes against that for us?
You're getting a degree in one of them. The environment in which we live in. Mm-hmm. Your master's degree that you're working on, and congratulations, entering into your dissertation.
Yeah, I am, yeah.
And yes, and with honors, mm-hmm. completing all those preparatory things. Sustainability is about what?
It's about securing, and sustaining in the environment, people, planet, profit, in a way that is good for now, but also good for the future. So that's the idea. Mm-hmm. So that the way that we live now doesn't come at the expense of future generations. And so there's this idea of we've got to be thinking through the planet and people, and then obviously prosperity with profit. Mm-hmm. But how do we do that in a sustainable way, which means that we get to live now well, but not at the expense of others, either in our lifetime or for future generations.
And dealing with all the pressures mm-hmm. that naturally occur or unnaturally occur. Mm-hmm. I was reading an article just this week about many people love swimming, right? Mm-hmm. We love swimming, surfing, things like that. Because of problems with wastewater treatment, with runoff and that sort of thing, there is a whole lot of effluent is the polite word, stuff that is waste from our bodies that is in the water sources. Surfers have a high probability of having a very high E. coli count from surfing.
Wow.
And ingesting water. They're in the oceans offshore, mm-hmm. and they're ingesting E. coli. Wow. People who swim in lakes and rivers.
I'm about to go to California. Now I'm thinking I don't want to go.
Sorry. Don't go in the water. Because so much, when it rains and all that, oftentimes that those systems will overflow and overfill. It goes someplace, it goes into the rivers, and then the rivers make their way to the seas, and those are on the shores, and then the tides bring it all back in. We don't think like that, but we must. Mm-hmm. And I use that as an analog for how much we ingest of waste, mm-hmm. products that are not
Like
processed.
the plastics. That's what they're saying about the, microplastics.
Microplastics.
We're literally eating them.
Well, we're breathing them. I don't know if you knew about this one. There is a relatively recent couple of studies that showed that we breathe in the equivalent in microplastics of a credit card a day.
Oh my gosh.
Good thing they're micro, because otherwise we are.
But I think
we can deny that these things exist. And I'm not just talking about that. I'm talking about all those pressures and such. The stress, the need. All these things are what we are constantly experiencing that literally negatively affect our being. Our sukha, in body, mind, and spirit.
And in a collective way, collective sukha, we haven't sustained with the environment. That's what we're experiencing right now. Is that we've been living in an unsustainable way. We haven't sustained. I don't know whether there is a collective sukha, but the collective sense of human beings on our planet. We're seeing the reality of that now, like you said, with the waters, with the microplastics, with the weather that we're experiencing. These are the effects of not only do you not thrive, even survival becomes questionable when you don't sustain sukha on a global level, but also that can be related to our individuals level of sustained sukha. So what does that look like for us, I guess, is the question. What does it look like for me, Tom? What does it look like for you to sustain, to support and relieve sukha in our lives?
One, while it's completely understandable that and the whole point of AHA is to allow homeostasis, which is life, to restore normal function. When we experience all these, or we sense or perceive these threats to well-being, it naturally triggers that flight or fight response. And we're seeing manifestations of that all over the planet and in individual lives. It's a lack of coping. It's a lack of a sense of well-being. And that is such a huge issue. So if we're going to sustain sukha, we want to think in terms of body, mind, and spirit. And what are things very practically that we can do that are beneficial in their impact and mitigate the detrimental to body, mind, and spirit?
Yeah.
It really can be in terms of body.
Yes,
What's your
stress.
What's your diet? Are you getting exercise? It's a simple thing. But that body in which we live, if we don't care for it, what's the mind like? What is the sense of your spirit? The sukha is suffering. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some very simple things that we can do. It's a mindset, though, because I think that once you start looking for something, the brain naturally supports you seeing it. It's what I call new car syndrome. So, for example, if you ever get a new
I've had
car,
this just recently.
Yes, you get a car. It's a particular model or a particular color. Suddenly they're everywhere. They're just all over the place.
And it's not because everyone's copying you.
And it's not because everybody just suddenly rushed out to get them. They were there. We just didn't see them. We can leverage that new car syndrome to focus on thinking about what would be beneficial. And then we start seeing it. And then we see more.
That's so good.
But it's that shifting to what would be beneficial for my body, mind, and spirit, And the brain says, oh, that's what you are interested in now. Yay. Not just feeling good and wouldn't it be nice and self-gratification, but what would be beneficial for us? I'm all over that. Look at there. Look at that. Did you hear that? Did you see that? And the brain just naturally propagates and motivates us to want to do that because the brain itself has a vested interest in surviving and wants to thrive. So develop that new car syndrome. Think about it and just make it top of mind. What would be beneficial for my body? What would be beneficial for my mind? What would be beneficial for my spirit? And then be proactive and act on it. Make the choice. Take that, just that first step. Because the first step allows a second. But without a first, there's stagnation.
Yeah.
That's what turns into survival.
Yeah. And the world, the culture that we're living in is coming against a lot of that stuff.
Oh, because it's in flight or fight. It's sensing threat to self, well-being, to the status quo. And there's an inevitable pushing back. But if we avoid flight or try to manage or control fight, we're not thriving. Thriving is not a function of the sympathetic nervous system. Surviving is. Thriving is a function of the parasympathetic. Rest, relax, recover, digest. And what supports those things?
Yeah.
And then just let your brain fill that in. And it will. Because it naturally wants to. It's just engaging that natural function rather than becoming fixated on the other natural function, which is flight or fight in response to stress, sensed or perceived. It's tempting. And the whole point of temptation itself is to focus on the threat. So here's the second part. We can focus on the threats and become absorbed with the threats to well-being, or shift to acknowledging the threat, but focusing on solution.
The sustaining, the supporting, and the relieving.
Yes.
So is there a difference then? What is the difference between supporting and relieving? I know what the words mean, but in terms of what it looks like, what could you explain further what that looks like?
Yes. Let me give an analogy. To support health, exercise. But exercise also has a function that relieves stress. It's a twofer. Yeah. I can tell, and I am very consistent with at least 30 minutes of vigorous exercise a day. That could be walking, it could be riding my bike, it could be going to the gym, it could be the yoga ball and all the rest of that, but I have a fundamental commitment to 30 minutes at a minimum, and it's usually more like 45 or an hour, that I make sure that I meet that in terms of physical exercise. Why? Because I know if I don't, I'm not only not relieving stress, because exercise does, but I'm also not supporting the health of my body. So do you hear the support and then the relieving? They're like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and I wonder whether this is really key, actually, because I wonder whether some people, support Sukha. So they're focused on the support side of it, But then on the flip side of it, so the relief can be the maladaptive ways of coping. They seek relief not from a healthy, beneficial place, but I just need to get away from stress. So whether that's Netflix binging or drinking too much or whatever it is. Whereas actually relief can it be the other side of the coin of support. And I think seeing them together like that is really helpful. You know, so that they're not separate things. They're a pair that work together to sustain.
And brilliant, because there is a relieving of stress, a relieving of pressure that actually is maladaptive. It just makes me feel good to X, but that X is something that is unhealthy in its impact on me. That's what I call a maladaptive coping response. And the irony is that maladaptive coping response can actually, in and of itself, not necessarily be an unhealthy thing, like overwork or some substance or food or whatever it is. It could be something that's healthy that's overdone. It could be working out, but working out obsessively to the breaking down of the body or to the neglect of relationships. So the maladaptive coping response that you honed in on,
which I learned from you,
which is a relieving of stress, but the nature of how I'm relieving the stress in and of itself is either unhealthy or I'm doing something healthy in an unhealthy way.
It's actually destroying sukha.
Yes.
It does eventually, in the long term, it erodes sukha, the maladaptive ways of coping and trying to relieve stress. So there's a really important thing to get
discernment.
Here. Yeah, with relieve, it's not relieving stress temporarily with, it is coming, it has to connect with the support. I think making sure they go together, like when you mentioned the exercise, actually exercising is supporting health, but also it is relieving. But if you do it in that way, if support is there, relieving cannot go into maladaptive ways. Would you say that's correct?
Yes.
Which is why those two things, I guess the thing I'm thinking, Tom, is, if I'm thinking through mind, body, spirit, and I'm thinking, okay, with my body, like what can I do to sustain my body? To think through the lens of, is this supporting and relieving? And if it's only relieving, it might not be a maladaptive way, but I think it's worth questioning it. But if it's supporting and relieving, then that's a healthy, beneficial way to sustain my sukha.
Yes. And so the idea here, and when I mentioned the word discernment, to sorting out, it's to ask the question, not just is this a healthy thing that is supportive, but what is the impact of that? And as you assess the impact, yes, it may be having an impact that it relieves stress in this way, but it's because it's inherently unhealthy or being done in an unhealthy manner or degree, it's having a negative impact on sukha. Is it supporting thriving? Or is it just surviving? Surviving, yes, but this is about thriving, and these are the ABCs of thriving. That's a thing. We can do that. But that's a proactive appreciation and valuing of sukha. That we are being, that we have worth, we have significance. We can care for our being, body, mind, spirit, life, relationships, because all of that together is what makes us us. What makes me me is Sukha.
Yeah.
And that can either be a thriving or a surviving.
Yeah.
And we get to choose. Oftentimes, we don't even think in terms of, I have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
We just think we don't.
Mm-hmm.
Because we experience something, these are those core issues, that is stressful or needful, and we feel inadequate or insecure, which doesn't mean we actually are. We just feel like we are. And then not being able to deal with that, make it go away or address it or whatever, then we feel powerless.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this negative anticipation where we create these scenarios of this is what I think is happening and going to happen. And reality isn't anything like that. I'm not talking about optimism and pessimism. I'm just talking about being realistic, and that oftentimes our negative anticipation is just not even a thing. So just say, no, not going to go there. If it happens, okay. But no, I'm not going to these vain imaginings. I'm going to focus on Sukha and what will be beneficial and its impact. And I get to choose, and I am empowered to choose my well-being. And if that's recognizing and addressing these negatives, these detrimental things in my life, okay, I'm going to do that, because that in itself is part of thriving, sustaining Sukha.
Yeah.
And then moving beyond that.
Yeah, I'm just curious before we wrap this this episode up, how much of it is to do with like sustaining, supporting and relieving like our own understanding of our own Sukha, you know? Because it's not just like we're all the same. There's part of this which is kind of sustaining who you are. And so I'm thinking of how within the world that we live in, and possibly the personality types that we have, or some of the perceptions or some of the history of stress and trauma, how we can, all of that big, massive world of stuff that can affect us. How, sometimes we can like blend or like into other people, or not really. And I think, or we can love everyone else and not love ourselves. And we can do all of these things so I'm just curious, one of the things that, Tom, you've said multiple times, and it's really impacted me over the years, is how, to be loving is to love ourselves, and out of that place then we love others really well. And I think for me in my world before that, it's just, and probably some of my personality type is that it's easier to love others and not focus on myself. So, but for me, when I think of that, that is sustaining Sukha, right? It's like, oh, I've got to learn to love me. I've got to, I've got to figure out who I am in the mix of this and love that person.
Yes.
And not try and be another person, or not blend, or not get to a point where I don't even know who I am. So that's part of this too, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the inverse for others, that all they are focused on is themselves and their well-being, and they don't really give a thought to the well-being of others. Yeah,
and so that's not sustaining Sukha either, because Sukha needs to have that, if it's too self-obsessed, that's not thriving. That's that's going to be going, that's not supporting Sukha.
No, because we are relational. We are social creatures. We don't exist in isolation. Human beings are human. Sukha, right, is a collective, communal thing, which is why we naturally seek out others and gravitate toward others. It's just, are those others that I am seeking out and aligning with, are they thriving? Or are they in a mentality of surviving? I don't want to align myself with others who are all about surviving. I want to align myself with those who are thriving. And then invite others into that thriving space. It doesn't have to be the other.
Yeah.
We get to thrive and sustain Sukha is thriving. To not sustain Sukha is to maybe, hopefully survive. But to sustain Sukha, that is thriving.
I love that, Tom. And next time around, we're making progress in this series. So we are going to be talking about the letter T. So I'm excited about that. But for now, listeners, sustain Sukha. Think about mind, body, spirit. You know, like Tom said, just even some simple, practical ways of how can I support and relieve these parts of me, of my being, and sustain Sukha.
Yep. So that continues.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.